Music got the most complex at the time of Bach, and then got only simpler. It's only gotten simpler since. And so let's try to unpack what I mean by this. If you listen to classical music, so I'm being a pedant here, classical music really means from Haydn on to Bach is Baroque, Handel, it's different. But classical music has greatly simplified Bach by developing the concept of having a tune, having a voice and harmony. So most of Mozart, there's a melody, a beautiful melody, because the guy was a genius, and then there's a gorgeous harmony with all kinds of interesting dynamic and so on. But there's a hierarchy. There is a voice telling you a story, and then there's the accompaniment to make it beautiful. Bach is not like that. There are the concept of voices. So Bach is going to have 6 voices, like the Goldberg, variations, which are 6 people having their own melodies. And the harmony is derived from that. So it's a completely different way of composing music. It was so complicated that people say, come on, let's get rid of this thing. This is just too complicated. We got to make it simpler.
Yeah.
And so it's been simpler since.
So tell me what you mean when you've written that Bach did not regard himself as an artist, but as a scientist, a cosmologist of music.
Yeah, so that also is an interesting story. So maybe we should briefly talk about, in the 19th century, there was a major change. The concept of art was radically changed. And so to understand this, let's take our time now. When Martin Scorsese has a new movie out, you hear that Martin Scorsese made a movie. A scientist does not make anything. An engineer does, but not a scientist. When you study astronomy, you don't make the constellations. You don't make the stars. You just try to understand what's there. And Bach would have never thought of himself as a maker of music. In fact, when he died, there's an obituary of a guy who really couldn't stand Bach. Bach made quite a few enemies in his life, and he wrote this really trenchant thing that says, in English, that Bach was a music maker. And that was considered the worst insult. This is like, not a music, he's a music discoverer. So Bach viewed himself as a discoverer of music, not as a maker.
There's that.
And so what's going on there? What's happening? And, I like to think, to simplify things, that as opposed to other composers, Bach targets the very young, the child, and people of a certain age, like me, and tries to leave out the middle. And what I mean by this is that there are all kinds of mental, psychological dispositions from the opera that he totally shunned. Envy, greed, lust, jealousy. I mean, this is the bread and butter of the opera. He never went there. He had no interest in that. His music tries to express things like awe, grace, thanks, fear, trepidation, hope. All kinds of sentiments a child can have and an older person can have, but not of this sexual nonsense in the middle. And so, in that sense, he thinks of death very differently from, also from his own experience. I mean, he lost his parents before he was 10. He lost both of his parents, and then he lost half of his children. He lost 10 children. And so these are different types, different circumstances, and so for us, it can be very surprising to see these reactions.
Right, but I think your point is he works in a very complicated way with that. One doesn't sense he didn't feel things deeply, right? The opposite.
On the contrary. I mean, you can tell from his music that his emotion is raw. I mean, it is so controlled, but it is so profound. So Taruskin say Bach is not about beauty.
Oh, yes,
He's
but
about truth. Well, you say, well, truth of what? Well, of course, if you think of Newton, God's truth, so the universe, so the musical universe. So that makes sense. But I'd like to take this even further, some historical nonsense, if you will. But I still believe there's merit to it, so let me try this. Immanuel Kant is a good half century, 50 years after Bach. So there's clearly, Bach was not influenced by somebody who lived 50 years later. There's no doubt about that. But Kant had a very interesting take on freedom, and this will connect to this. So he listened to Hume, and he said, Hume's got it exactly wrong. So Hume said that reason is the slave and must be and ought to be the slave to our passions. So, for most people, when you say, what does it mean to be free? They might say something like this: well, it's to be able to do what we want. So if you're in prison, there are many things you want, but you're not able to do them, so you're not free. So in that sentence, the key word is able. To be able, capital able, to do what we want. And Kant said this is all wrong. The key word is want. It's not able. And for Kant, freedom has to come from inside. And the only thing that comes from inside is reason. Or so he thought. And so, now, how do we go back to this disposition of Bach, which is that I think beyond truth, he also wanted to have freedom. In the following sense, he put all these rules so that once you are within the rules, it allows you to fly very, very high,
right.
And then you can be free. You're not tied to, so he's not going to do lust and sex. These are too easy, and it takes your music into things where you don't have a freedom because your emotions are taking you somewhere. So he would have been horrified by a lot of pop music where basically the first time you hear is the emotion. It's like, I'm very mad. Then you have something. I said, well, no, it doesn't work like this. Because your anger is driving your music, but that's not freedom. And so I think he was actually looking for a medium of truth and freedom.
So,
ironically.
and when you say, when you wrote, like Ellington, he doesn't do despair, I mean, what you mean is he chooses not to let despair have the last word or the last note.
Yeah. So for us, it's very hard to tell because we were not there, and it's just so hard to imagine how one could cope with such horrible tragedies on and on and on and on. But I think his faith was so big that despair for him would have been sinful. It's like, would have been self-indulgence to despair just simply to believe in myself more than I believe in God. Because he still believed that God was looking out for him. I mean, one would wonder given the circumstances, but he really believed that. And maybe that's how you had to be in order to survive in those days. But if something somewhat related, perhaps, I don't know, it's what I find very strange is this, that I think what's magnificent about Bach is that, when you listen to this music and it moves you so much, I mean, you're just a bunch of sound waves going crashing into your ear, and you have to contend, you see this emotion bubbling up, you start seeing like, tearing up, and say, what's going on? These are just sounds crashing into my ear. What's going on in here? So, of course, you can say, well, he's just Bach, he's a genius. That's just the way it works. No, not so easy. I have to have the ability in my brain to create that emotion. I mean, all Bach is doing is sending a bunch of sound waves. I have to be able, and when I say I mean everybody. Yeah. And so I'm always like, there's something extremely optimistic and really almost dizzying when you hear something and it moves you so intensely inside, and you realize, but this is you who is being moved. Nobody's forcing this inside you. So in your brain, there must be this reservoir of beauty, which most often is untapped, goes untapped. But if you can't find it with the right spotlight, then you discover this amazing, consonances or dissonances, or this amazing narrative story inside you. So I don't want to make this solipsistic. I'm not saying, we have our own music and so on. But I still think there's something completely remarkable that we are capable of appreciating this to that level. To me, this surprises me more than, say, a poem or something, because a poem, often you know where it comes from, because there's a story. You relate to events in your life. This moves you because
see what is happening.
You see what's happening because you can think of people, you can think of events. Right. There's this whole thing. Music, you have no idea. Why am I being moved? It's just a bunch of notes. What's going on? It's like a ghost is taking over, and yet it's all inside you. And so I think if there's a message for all this, is that all these people out there who have no beauty or so little beauty in their lives, and who think that basically is just everything is ugly, and maybe most of it for them is ugly, that they have to know that there is this possibility just inside them. There's this enormous gold mine that then can be revealed. And of course, Bach is not the only one. There are others. Everybody has to find their own way. But I really think that it's wrong. It's really wrong to say, well, I'm just the vessel and the genius out there is just, well, yeah, but that's too easy. I think we have to have more self-respect and saying that actually, there's something wonderful inside me. And I think we should be grateful and appreciate that and give others an opportunity to discover that in themselves, sort of those aesthetic virtues. So.